Our next unit will be on Boethius, the most influential philosopher of the Middle Ages, this side of Thomas Aquinas, and a martyr of the Catholic faith against Arianism. In the spirit of this trying season, and because it's a reading from the Chesterton curriculum, we'll be reading The Consolation of Philosophy, the classic medieval meditation on fortune, which is also perhaps the first self-help book in history. So before we start getting an overall idea of what the Consolation of Philosophy was about, first we need to take a look at the life of Boethius, because it's only in the context of Boethius' life that we can make any sense of the Consolation of Philosophy and what it was about. You could probably guess from the title what it might be about, but we'll have to get there. We'll get there when we get there. So, on to the life of Boethius. So, Anicius Severinus Manlius Boetius was born into the Roman aristocracy around AD 475, which was about the same time as the last Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed, around August 476. Boethius lived most of his life under the rule of Theodoric, an Ostrogoth educated at Constantinople, who was happy to let the old families, such as his, keep up their old traditions in Rome, while he wielded power in Ravenna. Boethius's privileged social position ensured that he was taught Greek philosophy thoroughly, and though it is unlikely that he traveled to Athens or Alexandria, the sites of the two remaining Platonic philosophical schools, he was certainly acquainted with a good deal of the work which had been going on there. He was able to spend most of his life in learned leisure, pursuing his vast project of translating and commentating philosophical texts. The Roman aristocracy was, by his day, thoroughly Christianized, and Boethius also became involved in some of the ecclesiastical disputes of his time, centering mainly around a schism between the Latin and Greek churches, which was resolved shortly before his death. Boethius's final years are well known to anyone who has read his most popular work, The Consolation of Philosophy. He agreed to become Theodoric's Master of Offices, one of the most senior officials, but he quickly fell out of favor with many others at the court, probably because he attacked their corruption. So what exactly happened there? So, in short, in 520, Boethius was working to revitalize the relationship between the Roman See and the Constantinopolitan See. So that would be the branch of the church based in Greece. Today, that is Istanbul, Turkey. Though still a part of the same church, disagreements had begun to emerge between them. This may have set in place a course of events that would lead to loss of royal favor. 500 years later, this continuing disagreement led to the East-West Schism in 1054, in which communion between the Catholic and the Eastern Orthodox Church was broken. So this was very early on in disputes between what today is the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. It didn't just suddenly fall apart in 1054. There were centuries of disputation, and this was one of the early disputes. So, in 523, Boethius fell from power. After a period of imprisonment in Pavia for what was deemed as a treasonable offense, he was executed in 524. And in the Catholic Church, we consider his execution to have been martyrdom, and he is on the calendar of saints. He is considered a martyr of the Orthodox Catholic faith against Arianism, because the imperial authorities were Arians, not Orthodox Catholics. The primary sources are in general agreement over the facts of what happened. At a meeting of the Royal Council in Verona, the referendarius Cyprianus accused the ex-consul Cecing Decius Faustus Albinus of treasonous correspondence with Justin I. So Justin would be the emperor of Constantinople, but we're in Italy, which was not under their imperial control. Boethius leapt to his defense, crying, The charge of Cyprianus is fault, and if Albinus did that, so also have I, and the whole Senate with one accord done it. It is false, my lord king. Cyprianus then also accused Boethius of the same crime, and produced 3 men who claimed they had witnessed the crime. Boethius and Basilius were arrested. First, the pair were detained in the baptistry of a church. Then Boethius was exiled to the Ager Calventianus, a distant country estate, where he was put to death. Not long afterward, Theodoric had Boethius's father-in-law Symmachus put to death, according to Procopius, on the grounds that he and Boethius together were planning a revolution and confiscated their property. So, according to historians, the basic facts in the case are not in dispute. What's disputed is the order in which they happened and the interpretation of what happened to them. So that's classic history issue. It's not about what happened, it's about how it happened and why it happened. So Boethius claimed his crime was seeking the safety of the Senate. He describes the 3 witnesses against him as dishonorable. Basilius had been dismissed from the royal service for his debts, while Venantius, Opilio, and Gaudentius had been exiled for fraud. However, other sources depict these men in a far more positive light. For example, Cassiodorus describes Cyprianus and Opilio as utterly scrupulous, just, and loyal, and mentions they are brothers and grandsons of the consul Opilio. So you can see there's 2 sides of the debate. There were, on the imperial side, you have people claiming these were good guys who were doing the right thing. On Boethius's end, him and his defenders are saying that they were corrupt, and he was just defending the Senate. So, Theodoric was feeling threatened by international events. The Acacian schism had been resolved, and the Nicene Christian aristocrats of his kingdom were seeking to renew their ties with Constantinople. So the Ostrogoths were Arians, but these aristocrats were not Arians. They were Orthodox Christians or Nicene Christians. They followed the Nicene Creed. The Catholic Hilderic had become king of the Vandals and had put Theodoric's sister Amalafrida to death, and Arians in the East were being persecuted. So there's a political motivation here that the party of the Arians, which Theodoric belonged to, was being overtaken by the Orthodox Christians that Boethius and the Roman aristocrats were members of. Then there was the matter that with his previous ties to Theodahad, Boethius apparently found himself on the wrong end in the succession dispute following the untimely death of Eutharic, Theodoric's announced heir. So there was a succession dispute too, and Boethius was on the wrong end. He favored the wrong heir. So when he was in prison, awaiting his execution, he wrote the Consolation of Philosophy. So, to summarize the entire work in brief before we start looking at it section by section in more detail. So, let's just get a bird's eye view. So, Boethius is despairing while he waits in prison for his execution. A beautiful woman comes to see him in prison. That's Lady Philosophy. Lady Philosophy comes to see him and to show him that his consolation give him consolation and show him that his sadness is misguided. So in the course of a lengthy discussion, she proves to him that true happiness is found in contemplating God. So it's a dialogue like Plato wrote. And it's very influenced by Plato. It's also influenced by Aristotle, that it was Boethius followed both schools. So Boethius is at first reluctant to understand the points philosophy is trying to make. His misery is quite real to him and has made him forget all that he once knew as a philosopher. She begins by showing how foolish it is to stake one's happiness on fortune. Fortune, as all should know, can be both generous and merciless. One should never count on anything as his own, but rather regard it as a temporary loan from fortune, which can be taken away at any time. Indeed, even if one never lost one's wealth, the wealth would still be worthless, for that is not what can make a person happy. And so here, when he talks about fortune, this is where we have the first image in history of the Wheel of Fortune, that it was not it was not always a game show. It was a medieval image of the arbitrariness of life. That one day things are good, the wheel of fortune turns again, and then all of a sudden, everything is a disaster. That I think we can identify with that. A few months ago, our biggest concern was not the plague. The wheel of fortune has not turned in our favor. So, back to Boethius. Most men believe that one of five things, or a combination of the five, is the formula for happiness: money, honor, power, fame, or pleasure. However, none of these goods can really make a person happy. And there is plenty of evidence simply in the fact that the people who possess them are often miserable. However, since men are naturally directed to seek happiness, there must be something about each of those five objects that is legitimately good. So we've talked about the Aristotelian idea that everybody pursues goods, and you might remember this from Plato, the hierarchy of goods. And when you read Augustine last year, you remember Augustine talking about this, hopefully. She then reasons that the ultimate good must contain all of those goods, but not, so to speak, piecemeal. So you're not, in the ultimate good, you're not going to have a little money here, a little honor there, a little power and fame there, and pleasure as a cherry on top. Rather, the ultimate good must be unified. She reasons that the ultimate good must be nothing other than God, for he is, by definition, the most perfect being, and the most perfect being must also be the best being. If he is the best being, then it is logically necessary that he is also the highest good, which in turn implies that he is also happiness. Boethius accepts everything so far, but cannot help feeling dissatisfied with his misfortune. If God is so good, he asks, why does he allow the just to suffer, while the wicked so often prosper? Philosophy argues that, though it may seem that way, in fact, the opposite is true. Everyone always receives exactly what they deserve. Since happiness is found by seeking the good, the virtuous are rewarded simply by living good lives. No worldly reward could rival the greatness of being close to God. In a similar fashion, the wicked are punished by virtue of their own actions. To live an evil life is the greatest misery. However, the wicked, she argues, are actually made happier when they are punished. Punishment will tend to curb their evil ways, and therefore, they might turn their lives around and start living virtuously. So it's that same Aristotelian idea that happiness is found in living a good life. It's not about amassing the most goods. Aristotle would say you need those material goods, a certain level of health and wealth to make it. But Boethius is going to go a step beyond and just say that you can live a happy life even in suffering. That even if you've lost everything, if you're living virtuously and contemplating God, then you are living a happy life. And evil people at the same time are not truly prospering. That the worst thing that can happen to an evil man is to be allowed to continue working his evil deeds. The winds of fortune are not meaningless, even if they do sometimes seem to be unfair. God is always in control, and he allows the innocent to suffer to test their virtue. By emerging triumphantly, they manifest their goodness and God's goodness to the entire universe. God's purposes are not always clear, but one might always have faith that he directs everything according to his perfect intelligence and perfect goodness. With the substance of her argument proven, Boethius is still troubled by the question of free will. If God orders the entire world and everything happens for a reason, this would seem to imply that man does not act freely. So this is the classic question that I just stated it, but I'll state it again, that if God is in control, if God is the cause of the world, if God has a plan for everyone, then how do we act freely? And this is certainly one of the most important questions in Christian philosophy, and it is still debated to this day to an extent, that there are, even among Orthodox Catholics who believe all church teachings, there is more than one acceptable view on how much free will we have. That the debate got so heated at one point that the Pope had to threaten both sides with excommunication and say both views are orthodox, so please shut up. But they haven't since, and they've been going at it for a long time. It's kind of fun if you're into that sort of thing. For my part, I tend to take a dimmer view of free will, but that's just because I've read too much Thomas Aquinas. Some people might take a more freewheeling view, and they have a right to do that. I'm just more pessimistic. Anyway, so back to Boethius. That's the big question is, if we have free will, if man has free will, then man could potentially disrupt God's plan. Yet, if God knows what man will do before he acts, it would seem that he acts, not because he wants to, but because God has preordained it. Philosophy says that this seeming contradiction arises only because of man's limited intellect. Man is time-bound and cannot conceive of how the eternal God knows what will happen. He does not see things unravel moment to moment, but rather each moment in the world's history is always present to him. While everything man does is in accordance with God's plan, it is also done in accordance with man's own rational nature, and therefore is a free act. Now, if you've gotten to this point, you're probably wondering, well, how does that work? And my answer to you is, I'll tell you later. This is just the intro lecture. We'll get to the answer in the book later. So this is one of the most important works of medieval philosophy. Its influence on literature ever since has been tremendous. From the age of Charlemagne to the end of the Middle Ages, it was one of the most popular and influential philosophical works. It was read by statesmen, it was read by poets, it was read by historians, it was read by philosophers, it was read by theologians. Everybody read Boethius. The way we might read Thomas Aquinas today is the authority. In Thomas Aquinas' own day, and Thomas Aquinas would have agreed here, Boethius was the authority. He was the great guy. Through Boethius, we came to know came to know a thought of the classical period and the ideas of Aristotle and Plato. That obviously the Consolation of philosophy was not the only thing Boethius wrote. He wrote many works, but the Consolation of philosophy is his most famous work, his most accessible for beginners. And so some have called Boethius the last of the Romans and the first of the scholastics. That he was the last person to embody pagan philosophy at its finest, but also he was the first great Christian philosopher. You might be thinking, well, what about St. Augustine? And to be honest, I'm wondering the same thing. I'm probably missing something here, but I think you get the point. So, the philosophical message of the book fits well with the religious piety of the Middle Ages, that readers were encouraged not to seek worldly goods such as money and power, but to seek internalized virtues. Evil had a purpose, to provide a lesson to help change for good, while suffering from evil was seen as virtuous. Because God ruled the universe through love, prayer to God and the application of love would lead to true happiness. The Middle Ages, with their vivid sense of an overruling fate, found in Boethius on an interpretation of life closely akin to the spirit of Christianity. In the Middle Ages, people had a very strong sense of fate. That the theologians believed in free will and believed that we could choose our own adventure, as it were. I can't believe I said that, but anyway. So the scientists in the Middle Ages believed in astrology, that we were determined by the stars. So Boethius isn't going to say we're determined by the stars. He's going to defend free will, but this notion of accepting fate is going to be important on both sides of the story. And astrology at that point in history was basically environmental psychology. The same debates they were engaging in, they're still going on today. We just don't realize it. We use different language. So the Consolation of philosophy stands by its note of fatalism and its affinities with the Christian doctrine of humility, midway between the pagan philosophy of Seneca, the great Stoic, and the later Christian philosophy of consolation, represented by Thomas à Kempis, the author of The Imitation of Christ, the great handbook of spirituality for laymen in the Middle Ages, which you should probably read and take notes from. I would recommend it. The book is heavily influenced by Plato and his dialogues. It contains both messages of Neoplatonic and Christian ethics. So the book doesn't actually talk about Christian doctrine. Boethius was a Catholic. He is on the calendar of saints. He is one of our martyrs. Some historians today don't believe he was Christian, that maybe when he went to prison he despaired of the faith and became a pagan. I think that's stupid. They weren't asking me, but I trust a calendar of saints sooner than I trust historians who want to erase Christianity. So, in any case, his work was massively influential to the Christian Middle Ages. It was translated into the popular languages of the Middle Ages. That King Alfred, we remember him from the Ballad of the White Horse. He translated it into Old English. A French translator, Jean de Meun, translated the Old French. Geoffrey Chaucer translated into Middle English. Queen Elizabeth translated into Early Modern English. A fellow by the name of Nocter Labeo translated the whole Old High German. It was popular throughout the Christian world, and as you can see with Queen Elizabeth, even beyond the Catholic world. The themes in the Consolation have been found throughout classic Western literature. That you have lady philosophy in Boethius, and in Dante you have Beatrice playing the same role, ascending into heaven. Milton uses the layered heaven, the layered universe that Boethius and Dante used. You find moral themes like opposing forces, the reconciliation of opposing forces. You find that in Chaucer, and the Wheel of Fortune that Boethius talks about. It's all over the Middle Ages. So to conclude, we'll just quote Dante on Boethius: "The blessed soul who exposes the deceptive world to anyone who gives ear to him." That the Divine Comedy, Boethius is all over the place. So check RunWeb for the first reading, and in the next class session we will start into Boethius, the first book.